My name is Tracy Harrison. I am the founder and lead instructor at the School of Applied Functional Medicine. Again, I welcome you to this episode and appreciate you joining me to dive deeply into the popular but often misunderstood topic of vitamin D. Indeed, it is one of the most recommended but misunderstood interventions in functional medicine practice today. In fact, this vitamin doesn't really function like a nutrient at all. Vitamin D is actually a steroid hormone with wide genomic influence, fairly complex immune effects, and also very real downstream risks that we risk tripping over if we simply treat it as a harmless vitamin supplement add-on. While low levels are associated with chronic disease risk, aggressive supplementation, especially with supraphysiologic levels, raised important questions about possible unintended consequences. Welcome to Functional Medicine for Real World Impact, where we're diving into the complex, interconnected nature of health and disease, exploring not just theory, but practically what it takes to turn functional medicine insight into powerful, practical, real-world results. So please hit subscribe and let's get started. I appreciate you joining me today for this episode, which is going to explore vitamin D biochemistry, common myths and missteps, and how practitioners can approach vitamin D with greater precision and therefore confidence of clinical success. Today, I've got 6 important topics that I want to share with you. And indeed, the last one is perhaps the most important and speaks to perhaps the biggest pitfall in vitamin D supplementation. So please stick with me for all 6 of these key insights. The first of the 6 is foundational. That vitamin D is not so much a traditional vitamin as it is a hormone. Just like all other hormones, it regulates genetic expression, and it does so via receptor activation. And thus, you can see already right away, having enough of the vitamin itself is not sufficient. We have to pay close attention to receptor dynamics. I'm going to talk quite a bit more about that today. But vitamin D is also essential for calcium regulation. It does so in a keen partnership with parathyroid hormone in the body. I'm going to talk quite a bit about that today as well, because I think our ability to measure this regulatory hormone, parathyroid hormone or PTH, is an essential clinical tool with regard to laboratory for functional assessment of vitamin D. But the clinical application or implication of vitamin D being a hormone and not so much just a traditional nutrient is that we have to pay attention to the overall context in which we are trying to boost or regulate a hormone and really respect the receptor biology at play. More is not necessarily better is a key theme in this topic. Because vitamin D has widespread genetic expression that affects everything from immune regulation in both our innate and our adaptive immune systems. It plays a key role with regard to pro and anti-inflammatory balance. It regulates both calcium and phosphorus levels. You may have heard in a recent podcast episode where I was talking about its essential role for maintaining tight junctions in barrier function throughout the body, in the gut, in the intestines in particular, on the skin, in the lungs, the blood-brain barrier. And vitamin D itself directly stimulates the synthesis of antimicrobial peptides as well, which is an essential immune defense function. But vitamin D is also critical for other key physiology, such as mitochondrial function, perhaps what you would expect in multifactorial effects from a hormone. Now, our ability to synthesize vitamin D or our downstream needs for vitamin D can vary widely based on our lifestyle, our biochemical needs at a given point in time, but also based on genetics. Individuals who have, for example, darker skin, higher levels of melanin in their skin, are going to experience less ultraviolet B penetration in their skin. And so we are able, with darker skin, we have a slower level of vitamin D synthesis. This means that an individual may need more sun exposure in order to synthesize optimal levels of vitamin D. Individuals of Asian origin, they're more likely to have genetic variants that can either impair the synthesis of vitamin D or make vitamin D receptors less sensitive. So pulling this first point together here, we have to think about vitamin D as being a hormone with richly complex effects and physiology in the body, not just a simple nutrient. In fact, to share a little bit more about the vitamin D receptor, just like other hormones such as estradiol or T3 thyroid hormone, the hormone itself only has an effect on the body via receptor activation. And so receptor responsiveness and local tissue activation can matter much, much more than simply intake of a nutrient or serum levels of a nutrient. And similar to other steroid hormone receptors, vitamin A sufficiency is a critical cofactor nutrient for steroid hormone receptor sensitivity, right? Starting to bring on board a little bit of the interconnectedness of nutrients here. We're going to talk much more about vitamin A in just a moment. Vitamin D receptor activity expression is blunted by high inflammation. This can mean that you and I could have identical serum levels of vitamin D, but your vitamin D expression could be markedly higher than mine, which right away brings us to the truth that serum levels of a hormone are not telling us what we need to know about the function of those hormones. And so we're going to be talking quite a bit more today about some of this more devil in the detail and complexity regarding vitamin D. But the first point is overarching. Vitamin D is a hormone. Even the form that we supplement with, the form that we make in our skin, is a prohormone and much more complex than a simple nutrient. Now, for the second point, I want to talk about sourcing and some of our physiological fundamentals, because contrary to common myth and certainly a lot of marketing themes from supplement companies, we are designed to synthesize vitamin D as a response to sunlight. When you get appropriate ultraviolet radiation stimulation in your skin, we generate a precursor form of vitamin D that is converted in first the liver and then in the kidneys to the progressive final form, the active form of vitamin D, which we refer to as 1,25 hydroxy D. But this endogenous synthesis is really how humans are designed to thrive in our natural environment. And it also points to the criticality of outdoor time, of natural, intelligent sun exposure. Very often, practitioners I've chatted with around vitamin D, they know that food is not really intended to be our primary source, which is true, because in reality, only fatty fish are a significant source of vitamin D. Things like herring and mackerel and salmon, pasture raised egg yolk also is a reasonable source, not a potent food-based source. And then vitamin D fortification using the D2 synthetic variety of vitamin D shows up in an awful lot of processed foods. But indeed, that fortification and high intake of the D2 form of this nutrient can be quite counterproductive. So we often know truly that we aren't designed to get D from food, certainly not consistently. But jumping to supplementation also can lead to a lot of pitfalls, not the least of which is easy, supraphysiologic supplementation that can be counterproductive with regard to immune function. I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. But we need to be designing our lives around intelligent sun exposure. So that we are able to be out in the sun, ideally in the earlier hours of the morning and the mid-afternoon hours. So we're away from the most intense sun exposure that can lead to sunburn and oxidative damage in our skin. But we need to be outside. We need to be getting intelligent sun exposure so that we can be catalyzing the synthesis of vitamin D in our skin. And of course, when we are slathering sunscreen on our skin, we are blocking the very radiation that we need to get in order to make optimal levels of vitamin D. And there are many pitfalls at play for the common cultural practice of slathering our bodies in sunscreen every single time we go outdoors. Obviously, man survived for a very long time prior to the invention of sunscreen. And instead, there's a very real opportunity for potent lifestyle coaching in your practice in teaching people how to experience intelligent sun exposure. And ultimately, supplementation should really only be considered during the months where we are not able to get that, or where individuals for other lifestyle reasons are not able to access this natural part of human thriving. Indeed, we could do a whole podcast on why we're designed to thrive from sunlight exposure. If you have a pet, you may have noticed that your cat or your dog naturally loves lying in the sun, even on a really warm day. And we've learned quite a bit about how natural sunlight exposure can increase oxytocin in the body. It can increase our production of endorphins and can actually help us not only with our physiological functioning, but even with our mood balance. So that's the second point in leaning on ideally physiological synthesis from sun exposure and counting on supplementation as a backup supply where necessary. And I'm going to talk more about intelligent and careful supplementation later on today. For the third key practitioner point, I would like to talk about lab assessment. We have widespread agreement that 25-hydroxy-D is the most appropriate or effective marker for assessing vitamin D. This makes sense from a utility perspective because 25-hydroxy is a stable, reproducible form of vitamin D biochemistry that also has a nice long half-life. And so it's easy and reliably measurable in blood. The problem is that 25-hydroxy is not the active form of vitamin D. It is, if you will, a storage form of vitamin D. And so there's a clinical trap in assuming that this is indicative of active vitamin D or indicative of vitamin D function or sufficiency of vitamin D effects in the body. And that is actually not true. Some analogies might be helpful. Saying that 25-hydroxy is an assessment of vitamin D sufficiency would be a bit like saying, I'm going to measure ferritin And if ferritin levels look ideal, then I can assume my iron levels are ideal, or I can assume my hemoglobin levels are ideal. And of course, we know that's not true. Ferritin is a storage of iron. It's letting us know about the available reservoir for function, but it's not at all speaking about downstream sufficiency. Similarly, we could measure T4 thyroid hormone, which is essentially a storage form of thyroid hormone, and say that if T4, total or free T4 levels are sufficient, then we can assume that downstream T3 thyroid hormone or T3 receptor effects are also sufficient. And you likely know that is also not true. And so there's value in having a stable, reproducible serum marker for vitamin D biochemistry, but it can lead to a lot of pitfalls. The first of which is having low levels of 25-hydroxy D may not be a sign of immune insufficiency at all. In fact, behind the scenes, while 25-hydroxy levels may be seemingly low, maybe a level of 20 or 25 or even lower than that, behind the scenes, our levels of the active form of vitamin D, that is the 125-hydroxy form, might be low, medium, or high. In fact, in the case of a rich variety of inflammatory dynamics, whether it is an autoimmune disease or uncontrolled type 2 diabetes or some type of other immune hypervigilance disease, or maybe just a good active infection. In those cases, 25-hydroxy may be lower because the body is pulling a lot of that storage form into the active form. And behind the scenes, our 125-hydroxy levels are actually elevated, which is simply a sign that we are aggressively responding. And in this way, low 25-hydroxy might be an effect of inflammation, right? Rather than a root cause. And this is a common misunderstanding with regard to vitamin D. But it could also be the case that behind the scenes, both 25-hydroxy and 125-hydroxy are low, pointing potentially to a more true insufficiency. But on the topic of lab assessment, especially functional lab assessment, that is looking at feedback in laboratory on a unique individual. How is my body and my current environment thriving or not with my levels of vitamin D? Ultimately, the best marker of this is perhaps looking at our parathyroid hormone levels. This might surprise you. Ultimately, this wisdom is about using calcium regulation as a critical clue for vitamin D sufficiency. I said in the beginning that the combination of vitamin D and parathyroid hormone together are regulating calcium in the body. This is critical because calcium is key for a lot of our biochemistry, certainly essential for mineralization of our bones. But excessive levels of calcium can also lead to plaque considerations and calcification and dysfunction of soft tissue. So the body tightly regulates calcium. Ultimately, you can use parathyroid hormone to assess whether or not a unique person's body, in its wisdom, feels like there's enough vitamin D activation, right? Not even 125 levels, but receptor activation. Are we getting enough vitamin D effects such that parathyroid hormone can remain low? So when you measure 25-hydroxy coincident with parathyroid hormone and also 125-hydroxy D, you have a much better shot of looking at the trio of markers from a functional viewpoint and assessing whether or not a person has sufficiency of vitamin D effects. If parathyroid hormone levels are high, this is a good indication that the body believes that it needs to mobilize calcium from our bones in order to meet the body's calcium needs. This is a sign that vitamin D effects are not sufficient. Because remember, one of the key effects of vitamin D is regulating calcium absorption from the gut, pulling calcium from our food to meet our nutritional needs. So high parathyroid hormone, I would say anything in the upper half of the normal range of parathyroid hormone is a good clue, especially if it is combined with low levels of 25 hydroxy D and also low levels of 125 hydroxy D. This is a true state of vitamin D insufficiency for this unique person. On the other hand, if you check parathyroid hormone, maybe it's in the second quartile, for example, a good normal level. And like I said, what you're seeing is low levels of 25 hydroxy, but often high levels of 125 hydroxy. That just means that your body is using actively a lot of that D, and it is inflammation-driven conversion of that 25 hydroxy form into the 125 hydroxy form, right? An infection, an autoimmune disease, right? The body is responding with inflammation. Now, that may be excessive. We'll come to that point in just a moment. But it is a sign that parathyroid hormone believes that there is sufficient vitamin D effects. Now, there's also the scenario where parathyroid hormone level may be high, but that may be alongside seemingly optimal levels of 25 hydroxy D. So maybe a vitamin D level of 60 or 80 or even 100. This is your feedback that the body is synthesizing plenty of storage vitamin D, but it's not having sufficient vitamin D downstream effects in order to counter additional regulation of calcium, right? So that's why you're seeing that higher parathyroid hormone. This is critical insight, and it's a common misstep in clinical practice that we need to address vitamin D biochemistry beyond the synthesis of the storage form. And this is where you want to start thinking about magnesium and vitamin A as being absolutely essential vitamin D cofactors. We need magnesium for multiple stages of vitamin D conversion to get us from the synthesis of the storage form to availability of the active form and even the metabolism of the active form. Magnesium plays a role in multiple enzymes for the synthesis and metabolism of vitamin D. And we may not be able to optimally convert it to the active form simply because there's inadequate magnesium. And given the widespread incidence of high stress states in our patient communities, insufficient magnesium is rampant. When we are experiencing chronic stress, we often are mobilizing magnesium from cells and increasing its excretion via the kidneys. This means that serum levels of magnesium may be optimal, but cellular levels are often woefully low, and we're actually experiencing a functional deficiency. So we really want to look for magnesium, red blood cell magnesium levels, to ultimately be in the upper third of the normal range. And indeed, addressing stress as a depleting factor is often key for helping people to maintain optimal magnesium levels. Excessive supplementation is another thing that can deplete magnesium. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But you also need to optimize vitamin A levels. As I said, we need both. Vitamin A in particular because of its critical role in activating vitamin D receptors. The particular type of receptor that takes up vitamin D, right? It's called an RXR receptor, needs both vitamin D and retinol. And we focus quite a bit on vitamin D supplementation, right? It's the powerful fat soluble vitamin for immune function. But we often forget that vitamin A is just as important. And it's the active form of vitamin A that you need in order to bring life to vitamin D as a hormone. But there are many people in your practice who are deficient in the active form of vitamin A. And so this is where the combination of nutrients makes all the difference. So to summarize here, we want to be thinking about functional markers of vitamin D effects, not just serum levels of 25 hydroxy, and not even just serum levels of the active form of vitamin D, the 125 hydroxy. The pitfall of that latter active marker is that it has a short half-life. And so depending on when it is assessed, it might be misrepresentative of the norm. So I propose you think about measuring a trio: 25 hydroxy, 125 hydroxy, and parathyroid hormone all together for functional levels of vitamin D. Also, red blood cell magnesium as a key cofactor, ideally looking for that to be in the upper third of the normal range, and also serum levels of vitamin A, specifically retinol, looking for those to be in the upper half of the normal range so that we're sure that the orchestra of nutrients needed to sing the song of vitamin D effects is indeed sufficient. Now, for my fourth point, I'd like to talk about dosing for vitamin D supplements and also blood level targets. Now, hopefully you already have a sense for the fact that, someone could have a vitamin D level seemingly insufficient. It might be 20, but maybe behind the scenes, their body is completely happy with vitamin D effects downstream, especially if their body is not being challenged with a lot of immune insults or defense or repair challenges. Bioindividuality matters. We often talk about a target zone for 25 hydroxy being more in that 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter range. But for some people, their levels may even be higher than that. But because of impaired receptor function downstream, like I said, their vitamin D effects may be inadequate. So you can start to see how the typical quoted 25 hydroxy serum levels and a target zone for that woefully miss the impact of bioindividual issues. I also want to speak to the commonly quoted target zone much higher for autoimmune disease. Indeed, we often are teaching or recommending a higher target zone, maybe as much as 70 or 80 or even higher nanograms per milliliter levels in the case of active autoimmune disease. Because vitamin D has immunoregulatory effects, individuals with the autoimmune disease can indeed get some significant relief by driving up their vitamin D levels. However, this could be at a significant cost because more vitamin D might be, for example, reducing pro-inflammatory Th17 effects, right? It might be impairing the activity of key immune regulators, upregulators like TNF alpha or NF kappa B. That is going to bring inflammation relief. But at the same time, behind the scenes, we might be risking trade-offs for that relief, especially when it is used chronically. One of those concerns is hypercalcemia. We can boost vitamin D so much that we drive serum calcium levels to an alarmingly high level. Again, risking soft tissue calcification. This is going to be especially true if a person has high levels of inflammation. Maybe they already have other risks of, for example, atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis, where we're worried about calcification of blood vessels for example, and having even worse endothelial dysfunction. It is also true that excessive vitamin D supplementation might be providing autoimmune disease relief for symptoms, but behind the scenes may be perpetuating or worsening an active infection that is at the root of an autoimmune disease from a trigger or mediator perspective. A wise way to think about this is that higher vitamin D levels could provide welcome relief and help to save a body part, for example, in autoimmune disease, but only as a short-term strategy while you're working to actually resolve the roots of that autoimmune disease, and not thinking about it as a long-term strategy because of the risks that I mentioned. Now, from a supplementation viewpoint, again, sunlight is best in terms of supporting our body's natural and innate source of vitamin D. But where we have to supplement, consider prioritizing vitamin D3 supplementation, not vitamin D2. The vitamin D2 forms is more resilient in the manufacturing and packaging and shelf life expenses for producers. So it makes sense that it's preferred as a supplement. It's a cheaper form. And it certainly is the preferred form for fortification of foods. However, there are some risks of using the vitamin D2 form or consuming too many processed foods that have a lot of vitamin D2 content. First of all, vitamin D2 has a lower affinity for the vitamin D binding protein in terms of actually using that D in the vitamin D biochemistry to get to the final active forms. We also know that D2 is less efficient in the liver for being converted to the 25-hydroxy forms, right? Vitamin D3 as a supplement form is much more effective at raising 25-hydroxy levels. And unfortunately, high doses of vitamin D2 can suppress vitamin D3 activation. And so this is yet another reason for minimizing processed fortified foods that can often present collectively with some pretty significant vitamin D2 intake. Another key principle I want to talk about is titration. Many of your patients and clients are using prescription vitamin D or other practitioner recommendations for large episodic megadosing of supplements. And this is not ideal for vitamin D any more than it would be ideal for other hormones like T4 thyroid hormone or estradiol, E2 for women. Well, first of all, we want to introduce any hormone supplementation in a low and slow progressive way that we increase gradually, that avoids unnatural bolus dosing and allows for gradual receptor sensitization and acclimatizing to the dose. So even if ultimately a much larger dose of vitamin D is going to be needed, we still want to begin ideally with a 1,000 IU or maybe 2,000 IU per day dose daily at most, so that we can gradually increase it. Individuals who do weekly megadosing often experience erratic effects, and it can actually lead to receptor desensitization. Sure, it may raise 25-hydroxy levels, but in terms of the downstream vitamin D effects that we're looking for, this unnatural episodic megadosing can promote quite a bit of erratic downstream hormonal effects. Once vitamin D supplementation is begun, I would consider checking levels no more than about 3 months afterward in order to understand how much of what's being used is actually being absorbed and what levels are being arrived at. And again, How is that functional marker, parathyroid hormone, responding? Generally, research shows that more and more vitamin D is not better, and that there is a bit of a U-shaped curve with regard to supplementation. But again, bio-individual hormonal effects can vary widely, and they are hormonal. So they are being determined via a receptor activation, not just serum levels. Now, for point number 5, I want to talk a little bit more about the risks of too much vitamin D. Certainly, vitamin D is a critical nutrient or hormone for immune modulation and tolerance. And indeed, it can suppress inflammation. It can teach the immune system to tolerate wisely. And it does this by, for example, supporting T regulatory cell synthesis. It can help to suppress overactive Th17 or Th1 adaptive immune behavior. This can help to avoid excessive or alarming effects, for example, of immune hypervigilance, like with allergy or atopy. It can also help to minimize negative effects and damage from autoimmune disease. However, we have to remember that high dose vitamin D is promoting immune tolerance. And if the immune system is already tolerating a chronic simmering infectious dynamic, then more tolerance might actually be suppressing helpful defenses. The reality is that we want an immune system that responds aggressively. And if there is a dynamic, like with autoimmune disease, where there's molecular mimicry and the immune system is attacking a tissue because it looks a little too much like a known threat, a known pathogen, then this is where ongoing high-dose vitamin D may bring short-term relief. But from a chronic supplementation viewpoint, vitamin D can become part of the problem. And so this points to the essential role of addressing the roots of autoimmune disease activation. We want to look for optimal vitamin D levels. We would like parathyroid hormone to be in like that second quartile, right? In the lower half of the normal range, but not hyper suppressed, not driving hypercalcemia, not promoting excessive tolerance in our immune system. The second point I want to highlight is that too much vitamin D supplementation too fast can actually end up suppressing appropriate immune response. One of the ways in which vitamin D provides relief for autoimmune disease is that it is suppressing our dendritic cell activation. And this can, again, suppress TNF alpha, IFN gamma, and can lead to over tolerance of our immune system. The third factor I mentioned is that things outside of vitamin D levels matter greatly, and we need to think about vitamin D receptor effects. Individuals in your practice, more and more, perhaps with your support, are getting genetic testing, and they may learn that they have single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, genetic variants that impair their vitamin D receptor function. And this means that having optimal levels of vitamin A are even more important for those unique individuals. So we just want to pay attention to not using high-dose vitamin D as a crutch for immunoregulatory support, where behind the scenes, when levels are excessive, we can indeed be perpetuating an infectious dynamic that promotes the sustaining of an autoimmune disease or of other chronic disease. And then the last point that I want to raise is really about nutrient synergy. And I want to mention again, focusing on vitamin D as a solo nutrient and not giving appropriate balance priority to magnesium and vitamin A and also vitamin K can be short-sighted. I've mentioned that magnesium is a critical gating factor for multiple stages of vitamin D metabolism. So again, think about assessing red blood cell levels of magnesium. Lots of practitioners make the mistake of only measuring serum, and because it's moderate or even seemingly optimal, they assume cellular magnesium is also going to be optimal. And hopefully you now understand that that can actually be not only misleading, but counterproductive. Sometimes our serum levels are elevated because of excessive cellular mobilization. Magnesium has left the cell and it's excessively in the blood, and it's going to be excreted, putting lots of pressure on our magnesium sufficiency. We want to make sure cellular levels are optimal, again, in that upper third of the normal range. Vitamin A, absolutely essential for receptor activation, as I said, because it's taken up in tandem. And actually, because high doses of vitamin D can block vitamin A absorption from a gut perspective, it's really essential that we be assessing optimal levels of vitamin A and make sure that an individual's diet is giving them what they need. We often assume that if there is optimal beta carotene intake from plant foods, that every person is going to optimally convert those carotenes into the final form of vitamin A. And that is not necessarily the case. Individuals can have impaired conversion of that precursor carotenes into the final form of vitamin D. This is especially true for your patients who have hypothyroidism or perhaps have advanced forms of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, where they're not optimally able to make that conversion. So we want to be assessing actual vitamin A to ensure optimal levels. But because vitamin D is playing a key role in bringing calcium into the body, you also want to think about vitamin K. We need not only the K1 form of this nutrient, but also the K2 form. Vitamin K1 plays a huge role in the body with regard to clotting behavior, which is critical for internal health. But vitamin K2 plays a critical role for appropriate calcification. Vitamin K2 helps to ensure calcium is taken up into our bones for providing good mineralization of bones. But vitamin K2 is also critical for avoiding calcification of soft tissue. K2 is actually taken up in an enzyme that directly inhibits soft tissue calcification. And this is where we want to make sure that there are good nutrient sources of vitamin K2 in our patient's diet. So there's a lot you can learn about with regard to these orchestras or symphonies of nutrients that act in tandem. It seems very complex, I know, to talk even today just about that vitamin D orchestra and how these nutrients and hormones act together. But indeed, you can learn to master this through the functional medicine lens so that you can recommend appropriate vitamin D assessment and management for a unique person with confidence. Vitamin D is indeed a critical consideration, especially in chronic disease. But as you now understand, just indiscriminate high-dose vitamin D supplementation can be a clinical risk. It might be promoting optimal immune regulation, or behind the scenes might be a quiet destabilizer or even a risk with regard to calcification of soft tissues or immune dysregulation. Indeed, the practitioner lesson here is that more is not better, and that serum 25 hydroxy D levels are only one of a trio of key nutrients that we want to assess for looking at sufficiency. And so I hope this has been helpful to you today. When you approach vitamin D now, I want to encourage you to stop thinking about it as being a single lab marker or a more is better nutrient supplement, because that shift is going to help you to optimize your clinical outcomes. And thoroughly learning about and understanding this orchestra of nutrients can help you move from a bit of guesswork to true clinical confidence. So I thank you for joining me. Have a great day.